In the summer of 1923, photographer Samuel Morrison thought he had captured the perfect shot. What he didn't know was that he had just signed his own death warrant. The woman standing before his camera wasn't just any Apache. She was Morning Thunder, a sacred healer whose image was forbidden to outsiders. The moment his shutter clicked, Samuel unknowingly declared war on one of the most feared warrior tribes in the Southwest. They say a photograph can steal your soul. For the Apache people, this wasn't just superstition, it was sacred law. And Samuel Morrison was about to learn that some laws are written in blood, enforced by warriors who had never known defeat, and punishable by a vengeance that would follow him across 3 states and into the darkest corners of his nightmares. This is the true story of what happened when one man's ambition collided with ancient beliefs, when modern technology met timeless tradition, and when the flash of a camera ignited a pursuit that would leave bodies scattered across the desert and change the course of 2 lives forever. Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the heavy camera equipment on his shoulder. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain, turning his photographer's vest into a furnace. He had been traveling for 3 weeks, documenting Native American tribes for the Smithsonian Institution, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The Apache reservation stretched endlessly before him, a landscape of red stone and scattered juniper trees that seemed to hold secrets in every shadow. Samuel had heard stories about these people, whispered tales in trading posts about their fierce independence and mysterious ways. Unlike other tribes he had photographed, the Apache had remained largely isolated from white society, maintaining their traditions with an almost supernatural determination. His guide, a mixed-blood Apache named Thomas Running Bear, had grown increasingly nervous as they ventured deeper into tribal territory. Thomas spoke English well, having been educated at a government school, but his eyes constantly scanned the horizon as if expecting trouble. Samuel noticed how Thomas's hand never strayed far from the knife at his belt, and how he seemed to listen to sounds that Samuel couldn't hear. The morning had started like any other during their journey. Samuel's assignment was simple: create a photographic record of Apache life for the museum's new exhibition on Southwest Indian cultures. The Smithsonian believed such documentation was crucial, especially as traditional ways of life seemed to be disappearing under the pressure of modern civilization. Samuel saw himself as preserving history, capturing moments that might otherwise be lost forever. They had been walking for hours when Thomas suddenly stopped, his body going rigid with attention. Samuel followed his gaze to a cluster of traditional wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of wooden poles covered with brush and hides. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, and the sound of voices drifted on the desert breeze. It was exactly the kind of authentic scene Samuel had been hoping to find. But Thomas shook his head firmly when Samuel began unpacking his camera. The guide's usually calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He spoke rapidly in Apache to an elderly man who emerged from one of the dwellings, gesturing towards Samuel's equipment with obvious agitation. The conversation grew heated, with both men casting worried glances in Samuel's direction. Samuel couldn't understand their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Something about his presence, or perhaps his camera, was causing serious concern. He had encountered similar reactions before. Many Native Americans viewed photography with suspicion, believing that cameras could capture and steal a person's soul. Samuel had always considered such beliefs to be primitive superstition, relics of a pre-scientific worldview that education and exposure to modern ideas would eventually eliminate. The elderly Apache man approached them, his weathered face showing decades of desert life. His name was Broken Arrow, and he was one of the settlement's leaders. Through Thomas, he explained that photography was forbidden in their community, especially of certain individuals who held sacred positions within the tribe. Samuel felt his heart sink. This was exactly the kind of authentic documentation his employers were expecting. Samuel tried to explain his mission, emphasizing that his work would help preserve Apache culture for future generations. He spoke passionately about the importance of historical records, about how photographs could educate the outside world about Apache traditions and perhaps foster greater understanding between cultures. The old man listened patiently as Thomas translated, but his expression remained skeptical. As they talked, Samuel became aware of movement around them. Apache men and women emerged from their dwellings, forming a loose circle around the visitors. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Samuel noticed that many of them were tall and powerfully built, with an bearing that suggested they were accustomed to defending their territory. Even women moved with a confidence that spoke of lives lived close to danger and hardship. It was then that Samuel saw her. She emerged from a wickiup decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols that marked it as something special. The woman was unlike anyone Samuel had ever encountered. Easily 6 feet tall, with a presence that seemed to command attention without effort. Her long black hair was adorned with silver ornaments, and she wore traditional Apache dress that had been crafted with extraordinary skill. But it was her eyes that captured Samuel's attention most completely. They held a depth of knowledge and power that seemed almost otherworldly. Thomas whispered urgently in Samuel's ear. The woman was Morning Thunder, one of the tribe's most revered medicine women and spiritual leaders. Her role in Apache society was both sacred and secret. She was responsible for conducting certain ceremonies that outsiders were never meant to witness. More importantly, Apache tradition strictly forbade any visual representation of such individuals, whether in paintings, drawings, or photographs. To create an image of Morning Thunder would be considered a form of spiritual theft, an act that could bring terrible consequences upon both the photographer and his subjects. But Samuel barely heard Thomas's warnings. From a purely artistic standpoint, Morning Thunder was magnificent. The way the morning light fell across her features, the dignified manner in which she carried herself, the authentic traditional clothing, she represented everything his exhibition was meant to showcase. In his mind, he could already see the photograph displayed in the Smithsonian, accompanied by text explaining Apache spiritual traditions and the important role of women in tribal society. Samuel knew he was taking a risk, but the opportunity seemed too perfect to pass up. While Thomas was engaged in conversation with Broken Arrow, Samuel quietly prepared his camera, adjusting the settings for the available light and calculating the proper exposure. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, loading a fresh plate and checking the lens focus. He had taken thousands of photographs during his career, and the technical aspects had become second nature. Morning Thunder seemed to sense what was happening. Her gaze fixed on Samuel with an intensity that made him momentarily uncomfortable. There was something in her expression, not exactly anger, but a kind of profound sadness mixed with resignation. It was as if she knew what was about to happen and understood its implications better than Samuel did himself. The moment stretched between them, photographer and subject locked in a silent exchange that transcended language and culture. Samuel felt a strange sensation, as if the very air around them had become charged with some invisible energy. Morning Thunder's lips moved slightly, as if she were speaking words too quiet to hear, and her hand made a subtle gesture that could have been either a blessing or a curse. Then Samuel raised his camera and pressed the shutter release. The mechanical click seemed to echo across the desert like a gunshot. Conversation stopped abruptly, and every Apache face turned towards Samuel with expressions of shock and horror. Morning Thunder herself showed no surprise. She simply closed her eyes and bowed her head, as if accepting some terrible fate that had just been sealed. Thomas grabbed Samuel's arm with desperate urgency. His face had gone pale, and his voice cracked as he spoke. They needed to leave immediately, before the full implications of what had just happened became clear to everyone present. The guide's panic was infectious, and Samuel found himself quickly packing his equipment while trying to maintain an appearance of calm dignity. But as they hurried away from the settlement, Samuel could hear voices rising behind them. Not the curious murmur of interested observers, but the sharp, angry tones of people who had just witnessed a serious transgression. He looked back once to see Morning Thunder still standing where he had photographed her, surrounded now by other tribal members who seemed to be both comforting and consulting her. Thomas explained breathlessly as they walked that what Samuel had done was more than just culturally insensitive. It was an act that many Apache would consider equivalent to assault or theft. By capturing Morning Thunder's image without permission, Samuel had violated one of their most fundamental spiritual laws. The photograph was believed to contain a piece of her soul, and possession of such an image gave the photographer a form of power over his subject that was both intimate and dangerous. As they made their way back toward the main trading post, Samuel tried to process what had happened. He understood that he had made a serious cultural mistake, but surely the situation could be resolved through dialogue and perhaps some form of compensation. After all, his intentions had been scholarly rather than malicious. He was documenting history, not committing a crime. But Thomas's continued nervousness suggested that the situation was far more serious than Samuel realized. The guide kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit, and he pushed them to maintain a pace that was almost a run despite the oppressive heat. When Samuel asked about the specific consequences they might face, Thomas could only shake his head and mutter about old ways and warrior codes that outsiders could never fully understand. By evening, they had reached the relative safety of a trading post run by a man named Jake Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had been dealing with Apache tribes for over 20 years. When Thomas explained what had happened, Sullivan's weathered face went white. He poured himself a large whiskey and drank it in one gulp before speaking. Morning Thunder wasn't just any medicine woman, Sullivan explained. She was the keeper of certain sacred knowledge that went back generations, possibly centuries. Her role in Apache society was so important that some tribal members considered her to be a living bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. The photograph Samuel had taken wasn't just culturally offensive. From an Apache perspective, it was an act of spiritual violence that demanded justice according to traditional law. Sullivan had heard stories of what happened to people who violated such fundamental taboos. The Apache had their own system of justice, one that operated outside the jurisdiction of territorial courts and federal law. When someone committed an act that threatened the spiritual well-being of the tribe, traditional warriors were sometimes called upon to seek retribution. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned missions carried out by men who had been trained from childhood in the arts of tracking, survival, and warfare. As Sullivan spoke, Samuel felt a growing sense of unease. The photograph was still in his camera, undeveloped, but captured on a glass plate that would become a permanent record of Morning Thunder's image. He had achieved his goal of documenting authentic Apache culture, but at what cost? For the first time since beginning this assignment, Samuel began to wonder if some knowledge was meant to remain hidden, if some traditions were too sacred to be preserved in museums and exhibitions. That night, as Samuel tried to sleep in the trading post's small guest room, he could hear sounds in the darkness outside. The soft footfall of someone moving with practiced stealth, the distant call of a night bird that might not have been a bird at all. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with images of a tall Apache woman whose eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went. He woke before dawn to find Thomas gone, along with all of his personal belongings and both of their horses. Sullivan found a hastily written note explaining that Thomas could not continue the journey. He had family obligations that required his immediate attention. The note was polite but firm, and it left Samuel stranded in the middle of Apache territory with nothing but his camera equipment and the consequences of a single photograph that he was beginning to realize might cost him everything. The hunt had begun, though Samuel didn't know it yet. Somewhere in the desert, Morning Thunder was consulting with the tribal elders about the violation that had been committed against her. The old laws were clear about such matters, and the old ways demanded satisfaction. By nightfall, the tribe's most skilled warriors would begin tracking the man who had stolen their medicine woman's soul, following a trail that would lead them across 3 states and into a confrontation that would test the limits of both traditional justice and modern law. Samuel Morrison stood in the dusty courtyard of Sullivan's trading post, his camera equipment scattered around him like the remnants of a shattered dream. The Irish trader emerged from his store carrying a worn saddle and a look of grim determination that did nothing to ease Samuel's growing anxiety. Sullivan had agreed to loan Samuel a horse, but only on the condition that they leave immediately for the territorial capital in Phoenix. The trader's usual jovial manner had been replaced by an urgency that bordered on panic. He kept glancing toward the desert horizon, as if expecting to see Apache warriors materializing from the heat waves that already shimmered in the early morning sun. As Samuel loaded his equipment onto the pack mule Sullivan provided, he tried to make sense of what had happened in the past 24 hours. The photograph of Morning Thunder remained undeveloped in his camera, but its existence seemed to have triggered a chain of events that was rapidly spinning beyond his control. He had come to Arizona as a respected photographer on a scholarly mission. Now he found himself fleeing across the desert like a common criminal. The horse Sullivan gave him was a sturdy bay gelding named Dusty, chosen more for endurance than speed. Samuel was a competent rider, but his experience was limited to the tame trails near his Philadelphia studio. The vast Arizona landscape presented challenges he had never imagined: scorching heat, treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of becoming lost in a wilderness that could kill an unprepared traveler in a matter of hours. They had been riding for less than an hour when Sullivan suddenly reined in his horse and dismounted. He knelt beside the trail, studying marks in the sand that were invisible to Samuel's untrained eye. When he stood up, his face had gone pale beneath its permanent tan. Unshod ponies had passed this way recently, moving at a steady pace that suggested their riders were in no hurry, but had a definite destination in mind. Sullivan counted at least 5 horses, possibly more, carrying men who knew how to travel light and fast across desert terrain. The tracks were only a few hours old, which meant the Apache warriors were much closer than anyone had expected. Samuel felt his throat go dry as the implications became clear. The pursuit had begun almost immediately after he took the photograph, which suggested that the violation he had committed was considered serious enough to warrant immediate action. These weren't random bandits or cattle thieves. They were Apache warriors operating under the authority of tribal law, seeking justice for a crime that existed only in their cultural framework, but was nonetheless real in its consequences. Sullivan urged their small party into a faster pace, but he knew they were already at a disadvantage. The Apache were traveling on familiar ground, using routes and water sources that had been known to their people for generations. Samuel and Sullivan were following established trails that were easier for their horses, but also more predictable for anyone tracking them. It was only a matter of time before the gap between hunter and prey began to close. As they rode deeper into the desert, Sullivan shared what he knew about Apache warfare tactics. These weren't wild savages fighting with primitive weapons, as popular fiction often portrayed them. Apache warriors were sophisticated strategists who had successfully resisted Mexican and American military forces for decades. They were experts at psychological warfare, using their knowledge of terrain and weather to create advantages that more than compensated for any technological superiority their enemies might possess. The Apache rarely attacked during daylight hours unless they had overwhelming advantages. Instead, they preferred to track their quarry patiently, learning their habits and routines before striking at a moment of maximum vulnerability. They could survive on minimal food and water, traveling distances that would exhaust better-equipped adversaries. Most importantly, they never gave up once they had committed to a pursuit. Apache justice was patient but inevitable. Samuel tried to focus on the practical aspects of their situation, but his mind kept returning to the moment when he had raised his camera and clicked the shutter. Morning Thunder's expression had suggested that she knew exactly what was happening and what it would mean for everyone involved. There had been no surprise in her eyes, only a kind of profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just her own fate, but his as well. The photograph itself had seemed perfect at the time. The lighting was ideal, the composition was strong, and Morning Thunder's natural dignity had translated beautifully through the camera lens. Samuel could already imagine how it would look when properly developed and printed, displayed in the Smithsonian's exhibition alongside explanatory text about Apache spiritual traditions. It would be the kind of image that defined careers and established reputations in the competitive world of documentary photography. But now that same photograph felt like a curse he carried with him across the desert. The undeveloped plate in his camera contained not just Morning Thunder's image, but also the evidence of his transgression against Apache law. As long as the photograph existed, he would remain a target for tribal justice. Yet destroying it seemed equally impossible. It represented months of work and the potential fulfillment of his professional ambitions. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became almost unbearable. Samuel's photographer's vest, which had seemed practical in Philadelphia's moderate climate, now felt like a portable oven. Sweat ran constantly down his face, stinging his eyes, and making it difficult to concentrate on anything beyond the basic mechanics of staying on his horse. Sullivan seemed immune to the discomfort, riding with the casual ease of someone who had spent decades adapting to desert conditions. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and seek whatever shade they could find beneath a cluster of scraggly mesquite trees. Samuel gratefully accepted the warm water from Sullivan's canteen, though it did little to relieve his parched throat. The Irish trader used the break to study their back trail through a small pair of field glasses, scanning for any signs of pursuit. Samuel asked if there might be some way to communicate with the Apache warriors, perhaps to explain his intentions and negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution. He was willing to pay compensation for any offense he had caused, and he emphasized again that his purpose had been scholarly rather than malicious. Surely reasonable people could find a way to resolve this misunderstanding without violence. Sullivan's laugh was bitter and humorless. The trader explained that Samuel was thinking like a white man, applying European concepts of law and commerce to a situation governed by entirely different rules. From an Apache perspective, the photograph represented a form of spiritual theft that couldn't be remedied through monetary payment. Morning Thunder's soul had been captured and stolen, and the only way to restore the balance was through the return of what had been taken, either the photograph itself or an equivalent price paid in suffering by the thief. The Apache concept of justice was based on reciprocity rather than punishment. If someone stole a horse, they might be required to give up 2 horses. If someone killed a warrior, their life might be demanded in return, or they might be required to provide for the dead man's family. In Samuel's case, he had committed an act of spiritual violence against one of their most sacred individuals. The price for such a transgression could only be determined by the victim herself, and Morning Thunder was known to be unforgiving when it came to violations of sacred law. As they prepared to resume their journey, Sullivan pointed out tracks in the sand that chilled Samuel to the bone. The Apache pursuit party had gained ground during the morning, closing the gap between hunter and prey with ruthless efficiency. More disturbing still, the track suggested that additional warriors had joined the original group, converging from different directions in a coordinated effort that spoke of careful planning and communication. Samuel found himself looking over his shoulder constantly as they rode through the afternoon heat. Every rock formation could hide watching eyes. Every distant dust devil might mark the approach of Apache ponies. The desert, which had seemed merely harsh and uncomfortable that morning, now felt actively hostile. A vast arena in which he was being hunted by men who understood its secrets far better than he ever could. The psychological pressure was almost as difficult to bear as the physical discomfort. Samuel had always prided himself on his rational, scientific approach to life's challenges. He believed in documentation, analysis, and logical problem-solving. But the situation he now faced seemed to exist outside the realm of rational discourse. He was being pursued by men whose motivations he could barely comprehend, across terrain that could kill him even without their intervention, for a crime that existed only in a cultural framework he had never bothered to understand. As evening approached, Sullivan began looking for a defensible place to spend the night. They couldn't risk traveling in darkness across unfamiliar terrain, but camping in the open would make them vulnerable to attack. The trader finally selected a shallow canyon with high walls and only one approach. It would be easy to defend, but also easy to trap them if the Apache chose to besiege their position rather than attack directly. Samuel helped gather wood for a fire, though Sullivan warned that any flame would be visible for miles in the clear desert air. They compromised on a small fire that would provide minimal light, but wouldn't create a beacon for their pursuers. As darkness settled over the desert, Samuel found himself listening to every sound. The scurry of small animals, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone formations that could easily mask the approach of Apache warriors. Sullivan told stories to pass the time, but his tales did little to ease Samuel's anxiety. The trader had spent 20 years dealing with Apache tribes, and he had seen what happened to people who violated their fundamental laws. Justice might be delayed for weeks or even months, but it was rarely avoided entirely. The Apache had long memories and longer patience when it came to settling scores. The photograph remained undeveloped in Samuel's camera, a constant reminder of the moment that had changed everything. He had options. He could destroy the plate and claim that the image had been ruined by heat or accident. But destroying the photograph felt like admitting that his entire mission had been a failure, that months of preparation and travel had been wasted on a single moment of cultural insensitivity. As Samuel tried to sleep that night, wrapped in a thin blanket on the hard canyon floor, he thought about Morning Thunder and what his photograph might mean to her. From his perspective, it was simply a documentation of her appearance and traditional dress. But from her cultural viewpoint, it represented something far more intimate and dangerous, a piece of her spiritual essence captured and controlled by a stranger who had no understanding of its significance. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their small fire, Apache warriors were moving closer with each passing hour. They traveled by night when the air was cool, and their movements were harder to detect. They knew every water source and hiding place within 100 miles, and they were guided by a sense of purpose that wouldn't be satisfied until justice had been served according to their ancient laws. Samuel Morrison, respected photographer and documentary artist, had become prey in a hunt that would test everything he thought he knew about courage, survival, and the price of crossing lines that some cultures considered sacred. The morning would bring new challenges and dangers, but it would also force him to confront the question of whether some photographs were simply too dangerous to take, regardless of their artistic or historical value. The night passed slowly, filled with sounds that might have been wind or might have been something far more threatening moving through the darkness just beyond the reach of their dying fire. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert with a brilliance that seemed to set the horizon on fire. Samuel Morrison woke to find that Sullivan had already been up for hours, studying the surrounding terrain through his field glasses and checking their horse's condition with the methodical care of a man whose survival depended on such details. The Irish trader's face was grim as he pointed out fresh signs of Apache presence. Broken twigs arranged in patterns that seemed random to Samuel, but clearly carried meaning for those who knew how to read them. The warriors were close enough now to leave deliberate messages, signals that suggested confidence rather than caution. They were no longer simply tracking their prey. They were announcing their presence with the certainty of hunters who knew the outcome of their pursuit was inevitable. Samuel's camera equipment felt heavier than ever as he loaded it onto the pack mule. The undeveloped photograph of morning thunder remained secure in its protective case, but its psychological weight seemed to increase with each passing hour. He had begun to understand that the image represented more than just a cultural misunderstanding. It was the focal point of a conflict between two completely different ways of understanding reality itself. They broke camp quickly and resumed their journey toward Phoenix, but Sullivan's route had become increasingly indirect as he tried to use terrain features to mask their passage. Instead of following established trails, they now picked their way through rocky canyons and dry creek beds that would make tracking more difficult, but also slowed their own progress considerably. Every hour they spent navigating difficult terrain was an hour that allowed their pursuers to close the gap. The heat was already becoming oppressive despite the early hour, and Samuel found himself rationing water more carefully than he had ever imagined necessary. Sullivan had warned him that desert travel was as much about water discipline as navigation skill. A man could survive for weeks without food, but dehydration could kill in less than a day under the merciless Arizona sun. As they rode deeper into increasingly desolate country, Sullivan shared more of what he knew about Morning Thunder and her role in Apache society. She wasn't simply a medicine woman in the sense that white society understood the term. Her responsibilities encompassed healing, certainly, but also spiritual guidance, the preservation of sacred knowledge, and the maintenance of communication with the spirit world that Apache culture considered just as real as the physical landscape around them. The photograph Samuel had taken wasn't just a violation of privacy or cultural etiquette. From an Apache perspective, it was an act of spiritual warfare that could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate participants. Morning Thunder's image, captured without permission or proper ritual preparation, was believed to give the photographer a form of supernatural power over her that could be used for harmful purposes. The mere existence of such an image was considered dangerous to the entire tribe. Samuel tried to process this information rationally, but he was beginning to realize that rational analysis might not be sufficient for understanding his current situation. The Apache warriors pursuing him weren't motivated by concepts that could be easily translated into European legal or moral frameworks. They were operating according to spiritual laws that had guided their people for centuries, laws that demanded specific responses to specific transgressions regardless of the perpetrator's intentions or ignorance. The psychological pressure of being hunted was beginning to affect Samuel's judgment and decision-making. Every sound seemed potentially threatening, Every shadow might conceal watching enemies. Every rise in the terrain could hide Apache warriors preparing to attack. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit that his untrained eyes probably wouldn't recognize, even if they were present. Sullivan maintained a steady pace that balanced speed with the need to preserve their horse's strength, but he was clearly worried about something beyond the immediate pursuit. The trader's experience in Apache territory had taught him to recognize patterns of behavior that suggested larger strategic movements. The warriors tracking them weren't acting like a simple war party seeking quick revenge. Their methodical approach and apparent coordination with other groups suggested that Samuel's transgression had triggered a response involving multiple bands and possibly tribal leadership at the highest levels. During their brief midday rest, Sullivan made a suggestion that chilled Samuel to the bone. Perhaps it would be better to destroy the photograph voluntarily, to eliminate the source of the conflict before it escalated further. The developed image could be thrown into a fire, the glass plate could be smashed, and Samuel could honestly claim that the picture had been lost or damaged during their flight. Without the physical evidence of his transgression, the Apache might consider the matter closed and abandon their pursuit. But Samuel found himself unable to accept this solution, despite its obvious practical advantages. The photograph represented months of preparation, weeks of dangerous travel, and the potential culmination of his professional ambitions. More importantly, destroying it would feel like admitting that his entire approach to documenting indigenous cultures was fundamentally flawed. If he couldn't photograph morning thunder, what else might be forbidden? Where is the line between acceptable documentation and cultural violation? As they prepared to resume travel, Samuel noticed that their horses were showing signs of stress that went beyond normal fatigue. The animals seemed nervous and skittish, constantly testing the air and turning their ears towards sounds that human senses couldn't detect. Sullivan attributed this behavior to the presence of predators, both animal and human, that the horses could sense even when they remained hidden from view. The afternoon brought new challenges as they entered a region of broken badlands where travel was slow and treacherous. Steep ravines and unstable rock formations forced them to backtrack repeatedly, searching for routes that wouldn't trap them in dead ends or expose them on open ridges where they would be visible for miles. Samuel's inexperience with desert travel became more apparent with each obstacle they encountered. It was while navigating one particularly difficult passage that they first saw clear evidence of their pursuers. Sullivan spotted movement on a distant ridge, tiny figures that appeared for only moments before disappearing behind rock formations. The Apache warriors were no longer concerned about concealing their presence, which suggested they felt confident about the outcome of their hunt. They were close enough to monitor their quarry's movements, but far enough away to avoid any defensive action Samuel and Sullivan might attempt. Samuel counted at least 6 figures before they vanished back into the landscape, but Sullivan warned that Apache war parties rarely revealed their true numbers to potential enemies. There could easily be twice as many warriors as they had seen, positioned at strategic points to cut off escape routes or respond to unexpected developments. The hunting party was probably large enough and well-organized enough to maintain pursuit for weeks if necessary. The psychological warfare was as effective as any direct assault might have been. Knowing that hostile eyes were watching their every movement made even the simplest decisions, which route to take, where to stop for water, when to rest the horses, feel weighted with potential consequences. Samuel found himself second-guessing every choice, wondering if each decision was leading them deeper into a trap that had been carefully prepared by enemies who understood the terrain far better than he ever could. As evening approached, they faced a crucial decision about where to spend the night. The broken badlands offered numerous hiding places, but they also provided countless opportunities for ambush. Sullivan eventually chose a narrow canyon with steep walls that would be difficult to assault directly, but Samuel realized that the same features that made it defensible also made it a potential prison if the Apache chose to blockade the entrance and wait for their enemies to run out of water. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, creating a stark contrast to the day's oppressive heat that reminded Samuel of how alien this environment remained to him. He had packed appropriate clothing for desert travel, but the extreme temperature variations were something he had never experienced in Pennsylvania's more moderate climate. Sullivan seemed unaffected by conditions that left Samuel shivering despite multiple layers of clothing. They maintained a cold camp that night, avoiding any fire that might reveal their position to watching enemies. The darkness was absolute in a way that Samuel had never experienced. No street lights, no house windows, no familiar sounds of civilization. Only the vast silence of the desert, broken occasionally by the distant calls of night-hunting animals and the whisper of wind through stone formations that had been carved by centuries of erosion. Sullivan told Samuel more about Apache warfare tactics during the long hours of darkness. These weren't random raiders seeking quick plunder, but sophisticated military strategists who had successfully resisted some of the most powerful armies in the world. Apache warriors were trained from childhood in skills that included tracking, camouflage, long-distance running, survival in hostile environments, and psychological warfare techniques that could break an enemy's spirit without requiring direct confrontation. The Apache concept of warfare was based on patience and precision rather than overwhelming force. They preferred to study their enemies carefully, learning their weaknesses and habits before striking at moments of maximum vulnerability. They could maintain pursuit for enormous distances, living off the land while their enemies exhausted their supplies. Most importantly, they understood that fear was often more effective than violence. A terrified enemy was more likely to make fatal mistakes than one who felt confident about his ability to fight back. Samuel began to understand that his situation was far more dangerous than a simple case of cultural misunderstanding. The Apache warriors pursuing him weren't angry individuals seeking personal revenge. They were representatives of tribal justice operating according to laws and traditions that had evolved over centuries of conflict with various enemies. Their response to his transgression was as inevitable and impersonal as the movement of seasons or the rising of the sun. The photograph of morning thunder remained undeveloped in his camera, but its existence had transformed him from a respected professional photographer into a fugitive fleeing across hostile territory. Samuel had always believed that knowledge and documentation were inherently valuable, that preserving images and information about disappearing cultures was a form of public service that justified almost any risk or sacrifice. Now he was being forced to confront the possibility that some knowledge might be too dangerous to possess, that some images might carry consequences that outweighed their historical or artistic value. As he tried to sleep on the hard canyon floor, Samuel found himself thinking about morning thunder and what his photograph might mean to her personally. He had seen her for only a few minutes, but her presence had been extraordinary, a combination of physical strength, spiritual authority, and quiet dignity that would have been remarkable in any culture. The image he had captured was probably technically excellent, a portrait that revealed both her individual character and her cultural significance. But that same photograph had also violated something sacred in ways that Samuel was only beginning to understand. Morning Thunder's soul, according to Apache belief, was now partially under the control of a stranger who had no understanding of its significance or proper care. From her perspective, Samuel wasn't just a rude photographer who had been culturally insensitive. He was a spiritual enemy who posed an ongoing threat to her well-being and that of her entire community. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their rocky shelter, Apache warriors were moving closer with each passing hour. They carried weapons that ranged from traditional bows to modern rifles, but their most dangerous asset was their knowledge of the desert and their patient determination to see justice served according to the ancient laws of their people. Morning Thunder herself might be traveling with them, guiding their pursuit and determining what price would be sufficient to restore the spiritual balance that Samuel's photograph had disrupted. The night seemed to last forever, filled with sounds that might have been natural or might have been signals passed between watching sentries. Samuel Morrison, who had begun this journey as a confident professional documenting indigenous cultures for a prestigious museum, now lay awake in a hostile wilderness, wondering if he would survive to see another sunrise. The single photograph that had seemed like such a triumph now felt like a death sentence that followed him across the desert like his own shadow. Dawn would bring new dangers and difficult choices, but it would also force Samuel to decide whether some prices were simply too high to pay for the sake of art, scholarship, or professional ambition. Samuel Morrison woke to the sound of Sullivan's urgent whisper cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The Irish trader was crouched at the mouth of their canyon shelter, peering out at something that had captured his complete attention. When Samuel crawled up beside him, His blood went cold at what he saw silhouetted against the lightening sky. Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses along the canyon rim, positioned at regular intervals like sentries guarding a prison. They had arrived during the night with such stealth that neither Samuel nor Sullivan had heard their approach. Now they waited with the patient stillness of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Sullivan counted at least a dozen figures visible in the growing light, but he warned that there were probably more positioned out of sight. The Apache had them completely surrounded, turning their defensive shelter into an effective trap. The same narrow canyon that had seemed to offer protection the night before now appeared to be their tomb. As the sun rose higher, more details became visible. The warriors were armed with a mixture of traditional and modern weapons, bows alongside rifles, war clubs next to ammunition belts. They wore a combination of traditional Apache clothing and practical gear acquired through trade or warfare with white settlements. Most disturbing of all, they showed no signs of impatience or uncertainty. These men had done this before, and they knew exactly how such situations typically concluded. Samuel's hands shook as he checked his camera equipment, though he couldn't say why preserving his photographs seemed important when his life was obviously in immediate danger. The undeveloped image of morning thunder felt like a weight that was dragging him toward destruction, but he still couldn't bring himself to consider destroying it voluntarily. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was professional stubbornness, or perhaps it was simply the inability to admit that his entire mission had been a catastrophic mistake from the beginning. Sullivan suggested they try to negotiate, though his tone made it clear he held little hope for a peaceful resolution. The Apache had invested too much time and effort in this pursuit to abandon it now, and Samuel's transgression was too serious to be resolved through simple discussion. Still, talking might buy them time to think of alternatives, and it would certainly be better than waiting passively for whatever the warriors had planned. A single Apache rider began descending into the canyon, moving with casual confidence that suggested he felt no fear of the two white men trapped below. He was older than the others Samuel could see, with gray streaking his long black hair and scars that spoke of many battles survived. His presence commanded immediate respect from the other warriors, who watched his approach with the attention of subordinates observing their leader. The warrior introduced himself through a mixture of English and gestures as Standing Bear, a war chief who had been selected to speak for the pursuit party. His English was limited, but adequate for basic communication, and his manner was formally polite in a way that somehow made the situation more rather than less threatening. He wasn't angry or emotional. He was simply a man carrying out responsibilities that had been assigned to him by higher authorities. Standing Bear explained that they had come to reclaim what had been stolen and to ensure that justice was served according to Apache law. The photograph Samuel had taken contained a piece of Morning Thunder's soul, and its continued existence posed an ongoing threat to her spiritual well-being and that of the entire tribe. The image must be returned or destroyed, and the photographer must pay an appropriate price for the violation he had committed. Samuel tried to explain his scholarly intentions, emphasizing that he was a professional photographer working for a respected museum rather than a malicious intruder seeking to cause harm. He offered to pay compensation for any offense he had caused and promised never to return to Apache territory if his transgression could be forgiven. His voice cracked with stress as he spoke, and he could hear the desperation that was beginning to creep into his words. Standing Bear listened patiently as Sullivan translated the more complex parts of Samuel's plea, but his expression remained unchanged. He explained that Morning Thunder herself had traveled with the pursuit party and would decide what price was appropriate for the crime that had been committed against her. The war chief was merely a representative carrying out orders that had been determined by someone with far greater spiritual authority than his own. At a signal from Standing Bear, the Apache warriors began moving down into the canyon from multiple directions. They approached with weapons ready, but not directly threatening, surrounding Samuel and Sullivan with a circle that steadily contracted until escape was impossible. Their faces showed no hatred or anger, only the professional focus of men carrying out an unpleasant but necessary task. It was then that Morning Thunder herself appeared at the canyon rim, riding a magnificent black horse that moved with supernatural grace across terrain that would have challenged most animals. Even at a distance, her presence was unmistakable, the same commanding dignity that Samuel had tried to capture in his photograph. but now enhanced by an aura of spiritual power that seemed to make the very air around her shimmer with energy. She descended into the canyon slowly, allowing Samuel to study her features as she approached. Her face showed no emotion that he could interpret, but her eyes seemed to look directly through him to something hidden beneath the surface of his consciousness. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made further argument seem not just futile, but actively dangerous. Morning Thunder addressed Samuel directly in accented but clear English, asking why he had stolen her soul without permission and what he intended to do with the spiritual power he had taken from her. Her questions weren't motivated by curiosity. She already knew the answers. She was forcing Samuel to confront the true nature of his actions and their consequences according to laws and beliefs that he had never bothered to understand. Samuel found himself unable to speak coherently. The woman before him wasn't the exotic subject he had photographed for his museum exhibition. She was a living embodiment of powers and traditions that existed far beyond the realm of academic documentation. His camera had captured her image, but it had also entangled him in a web of spiritual consequences that he was completely unprepared to handle. Morning Thunder continued speaking, explaining that the photograph represented more than just a visual record of her appearance. According to Apache belief, images created without proper ritual preparation could be used for harmful magic, allowing enemies to attack their victims from great distances through supernatural means. The mere existence of such a photograph was considered an ongoing assault that would continue until the image was either returned to its rightful owner or destroyed through appropriate ceremonies. She offered Samuel a choice. He could surrender the photograph voluntarily and accept a punishment that would involve physical pain, but not death. Alternatively, he could refuse to cooperate and face justice according to the harshest interpretations of Apache law, which might require his life as payment for the spiritual violence he had committed. The decision was his, but it had to be made immediately before the situation escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Samuel looked at his camera equipment, then at Sullivan's pale face, then at the circle of Apache warriors who waited with the patience of men who had seen this scenario play out many times before. The photograph of Morning Thunder was still undeveloped, still recoverable if he acted quickly. But surrendering it would mean admitting that months of work and preparation had been wasted on a single moment of cultural blindness. The silence stretched between them as Samuel wrestled with a decision that would determine not only his immediate fate, but also his understanding of the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. He had always believed that documentation and preservation were inherently valuable activities that justified almost any risk or sacrifice. Now he was being forced to confront the possibility that some knowledge might be too dangerous to possess, that some images might carry spiritual consequences that outweighed their scholarly or artistic value. Morning Thunder waited with the stillness of someone accustomed to difficult decisions and their inevitable consequences. Her presence seemed to fill the entire canyon, creating an atmosphere of spiritual tension that made rational thought almost impossible. Samuel could feel the weight of her gaze as she studied his face, reading intentions and fears that he probably didn't fully understand himself. Standing Bear spoke quietly to some of the other warriors, and Samuel caught enough words to understand that preparations were being made for either outcome. If he cooperated, certain ceremonies would be required to neutralize the spiritual danger posed by his photograph. If he refused, the warriors were ready to carry out whatever justice Morning Thunder deemed appropriate for his transgression. Sullivan whispered urgently that Samuel should accept whatever terms were offered, that survival was more important than professional pride or scholarly ambition. The Irish trader had seen enough Apache justice to know that their mercy, when it was offered, was not something to be refused lightly. This might be the only chance Samuel would have to escape with his life, regardless of what it might cost him in terms of career prospects or personal dignity. Samuel's hands moved toward his camera case, then stopped as he imagined the moment when Morning Thunder's image would be exposed to light and destroyed forever. The photograph represented everything he had hoped to achieve with this expedition: authentic documentation of Apache culture that could educate future generations about traditions and ways of life that seemed to be disappearing under pressure from modern civilization. But as he looked into Morning Thunder's eyes, Samuel began to understand that some traditions weren't disappearing at all. They were simply hidden from outsiders who lacked the wisdom or respect to approach them properly. His photograph hadn't preserved Apache culture. It had violated something sacred in ways that his academic training had never prepared him to recognize or understand. The moment of decision had arrived, and Samuel Morrison realized that he was about to learn whether some knowledge was indeed too dangerous to possess, whether some images carried consequences that no amount of scholarly justification could adequately address. Morning thunder and her warriors waited in the desert silence, ready to demonstrate that ancient laws still carried weight in a world that thought it had moved beyond such primitive considerations. The photograph that had seemed like the culmination of his professional career now felt like a death sentence that had followed him across 3 states and into the heart of a conflict between 2 completely different ways of understanding reality itself. Samuel's choice would determine not only his immediate survival, but also his future relationship with the power of images and the responsibilities that came with documenting cultures that he was only beginning to understand. The sun climbed higher over the Arizona Badlands, and the moment of reckoning could no longer be delayed. Samuel Morrison's hands trembled as he reached for the camera case that contained Morning Thunder's image. The weight of Apache eyes upon him felt heavier than the desert heat, and the silence in the canyon seemed to stretch into eternity. Every warrior present understood the significance of this moment. Not just the resolution of their pursuit, but a test of whether the white photographer had learned anything from his encounter with forces beyond his comprehension. Morning Thunder dismounted from her black horse and approached Samuel with measured steps. Her movement was ceremonial, ritualistic, as if she were participating in a sacred dance that required precise choreography. When she stopped just beyond arm's reach, Samuel could feel an almost physical presence emanating from her, a spiritual energy that made his skin prickle and his breath catch in his throat. She extended her hand, palm upward, in a gesture that was both demand and invitation. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But there's also something else in her tone. Not quite mercy, but perhaps the possibility of understanding between 2 people who had approached this confrontation from completely different worlds. Samuel looked down at his camera equipment, then at Sullivan's encouraging nod, then back into Morning Thunder's eyes. In that moment, he finally understood what his photograph had really captured. It wasn't just an image of an Apache woman in traditional dress. It was a visual record of someone whose spiritual responsibilities extended far beyond anything his academic training had prepared him to recognize. With movements that felt weighted with significance, Samuel opened the camera case and removed the undeveloped photographic plate that contained Morning Thunder's image. The glass felt warm in his hands, as if it were charged with some form of energy that existed outside the realm of normal physical properties. He could almost feel the captured light that would, when properly developed, reveal the face and form of the woman who stood before him. Morning Thunder accepted the plate with reverence that surprised Samuel. She held it carefully, studying its surface as if she could see through to the latent image hidden within the light-sensitive chemicals. Her lips moved silently, forming words in Apache that might have been prayers or might have been commands directed towards spiritual forces that only she could perceive. Standing Bear produced a small leather pouch from his belt and sprinkled a pinch of what looked like powdered minerals onto the photographic plate. Morning Thunder continued her silent recitation, and Samuel watched in fascination as she performed what was obviously a cleansing ceremony designed to neutralize whatever spiritual contamination his unauthorized photography might have caused. The ritual concluded when Morning Thunder placed the photographic plate on a flat rock and struck it sharply with a stone hammer that Standing Bear provided for the purpose. The glass shattered into hundreds of fragments that caught the morning sunlight like tiny mirrors, each piece reflecting light in different directions before settling into the desert sand, where they would eventually be worn smooth by wind and weather. Samuel felt an unexpected sense of loss as he watched his photograph disappear forever. The image that had cost him so much effort and put him in such danger was now nothing more than broken glass scattered across the canyon floor. Months of preparation and dangerous travel had culminated in this moment of destruction, and he found himself wondering whether the knowledge he had gained was worth the price he had paid to acquire it. But Morning Thunder wasn't finished with him yet. She began speaking in English, explaining that destroying the photograph was only the first step in restoring the spiritual balance that his transgression had disrupted. According to Apache law, Samuel had committed an act of theft that required appropriate compensation to be paid to the victim and the community that had been harmed by his actions. The punishment she proposed was both simpler and more complex than Samuel had expected. He would be required to spend 1 full year learning about Apache culture from the inside, living among the people whose traditions he had violated, and gaining the understanding that should have preceded any attempt at documentation. Only after demonstrating genuine respect for Apache ways would he be permitted to leave their territory and return to his former life. Samuel's initial reaction was relief that his life would be spared, but as Morning Thunder continued explaining the conditions of his sentence, he began to understand that what she was proposing would amount to the complete dismantling of his previous existence. He would be required to abandon his photography equipment, his professional commitments, and his comfortable life in Philadelphia. Everything that had defined his identity would have to be set aside in favor of an education in ways of thinking and being that challenge his most fundamental assumptions about reality. Sullivan expressed concern about the practical aspects of such an arrangement, pointing out that Samuel had obligations and responsibilities in the white world that couldn't simply be ignored for an entire year. But Morning Thunder was unmoved by such objections. From her perspective, Samuel's previous commitments were irrelevant compared to the spiritual education he needed to receive before he could safely interact with indigenous cultures. The alternative she offered was stark in its simplicity. Samuel could refuse to accept her terms and face justice according to the harshest interpretations of Apache law, which might well cost him his life. The warriors surrounding them were prepared to carry out whatever sentence she decreed, and their patient demeanor suggested that they had no personal preference about which option Samuel might choose. As Samuel considered his situation, he found himself thinking about the photograph that had started this entire chain of events. From his original perspective, it had been a simple documentation of Apache culture, valuable for its authenticity and artistic merit. But Morning Thunder's reaction had revealed layers of meaning and significance that his academic training had never prepared him to recognize. The image hadn't just recorded her physical appearance. It had captured something that Apache culture considered to be a piece of her soul. The photograph had created a spiritual vulnerability that could potentially be exploited by enemies who understood how to use such images for harmful purposes. From Morning Thunder's perspective, Samuel's camera hadn't just taken her picture. It had committed an act of spiritual warfare that threatened her safety and that of her entire community. Samuel realized that his year of education wouldn't just be about learning Apache customs and traditions. He would be required to develop entirely new ways of thinking about the relationship between images and reality, between knowledge and responsibility, between cultural documentation and spiritual violation. The comfortable certainties that had guided his professional life would have to be examined and probably abandoned in favor of understandings that might fundamentally change who he was as a person. Standing Bear spoke briefly with Morning Thunder in Apache, and Samuel caught enough words to understand that they were discussing the practical arrangements for his custody and education. He would be assigned to a family group that would be responsible for his welfare and instruction. His teachers would include both men and women who had been selected for their knowledge of traditional ways and their ability to communicate complex concepts to someone from an alien cultural background. The education Samuel would receive wouldn't be available in any university or museum. He would learn directly from people who carried sacred knowledge that had been passed down through generations of careful instruction and spiritual discipline. He would participate in ceremonies and rituals that had never been witnessed by outsiders, and he would gain access to understandings that most white academics could only speculate about from a distance. But such knowledge would come with profound responsibilities. Samuel would be bound by the same spiritual laws that governed Apache society, and violations of sacred trust would carry the same consequences for him as for any tribal member. He would be expected to demonstrate not just intellectual understanding, but genuine transformation of character and perspective. As Morning Thunder waited for his decision, Samuel found himself thinking about the life he would be leaving behind. His photography studio in Philadelphia, his professional reputation, his comfortable routines, and familiar surroundings, all of it would have to be abandoned for an existence that he couldn't even properly imagine. The security and predictability of his former world would be replaced by challenges that might transform him in ways he wasn't sure he was prepared to accept. But the alternative was even less acceptable. The Apache warriors surrounding them weren't bluffing about their willingness to carry out whatever justice Morning Thunder deemed appropriate. Samuel had seen enough during his brief time in their territory to understand that these people took their spiritual laws as seriously as white society took its civil and criminal codes. Refusing to accept her terms would almost certainly result in his death, and probably Sullivan's as well. Samuel looked one last time at the scattered fragments of his photograph, then raised his eyes to meet Morning Thunder's steady gaze. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but his words carried across the canyon with perfect clarity. He accepted her terms and placed himself under Apache law for whatever education and transformation she deemed necessary. Morning Thunder nodded with satisfaction that suggested she had expected this outcome from the beginning. She spoke briefly to Standing Bear, who began issuing instructions to the other warriors about breaking camp and preparing for the return journey to tribal territory. Samuel's horse and equipment would be taken care of, though his cameras and photographic supplies would be stored away until he had earned the right to use them responsibly. Sullivan was permitted to leave with a message for Samuel's employers at the Smithsonian Institution. The Irish trader would explain that the photographer had encountered unexpected delays and would be unable to complete his assignment as originally planned. Any further questions about Samuel's fate would have to wait until he had fulfilled his obligations under Apache law and been granted permission to resume contact with the white world. As the Apache party prepared to leave the canyon, Samuel took a final look at the desert landscape that had been the scene of his pursuit and capture. The broken badlands that had seemed so hostile and alien just hours before now appeared different somehow, not welcoming exactly, but no longer completely foreign. He was about to begin a journey into ways of understanding that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality, knowledge, and the proper relationship between different cultures. The year ahead would be unlike anything Samuel Morrison had ever imagined. He would live among people whose spiritual traditions stretched back centuries, learning to see the world through eyes that perceive connections and meanings invisible to his European-trained consciousness. The comfortable boundaries between sacred and secular, between image and reality, between observer and participant would all be dissolved in favor of understandings that might make him a very different person by the time his education was complete. Morning Thunder mounted her black horse and looked back at Samuel one last time before the party began moving out of the canyon. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that might have been approval, or perhaps simply the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served according to the ancient laws of her people. Samuel Morrison, respected photographer and museum documentarian, had ceased to exist the moment he agreed to place himself under Apache law. The man who would eventually emerge from his year of education might bear the same name, but he would carry knowledge and responsibilities that would forever change his relationship with the power of images and the sacred trust required for true cultural understanding. The pursuit was over, but the real journey was just beginning.